Welcome to the deep dive. We're really glad you could join us today. Imagine, for just a second, what happens when the world's most powerful military force treats a conflict against a 2,700-year-old civilization, like a high-stakes New York real estate negotiation.
It's a pretty massive mismatch.
Right, because the standard playbook is simple, right? You
Yeah.
apply massive pressure, you inflict terrible damage, and you basically just wait for the other side to cry uncle and, sign on the dotted line. But what if they don't? What if every single conventional military expectation just completely falls apart?
That exact tension is, well, it's the crux of what we are analyzing today.
Yeah, we're looking at an incredibly dense, highly provocative excerpt from an interview. It's between Glenn Deason and Colonel Douglas Macgregor. And for some quick context on who we're talking about, Macgregor is a decorated combat veteran and a former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense.
Which is a perspective you don't hear every day.
Exactly. And in this discussion, they are mapping out a hypothetical, or depending on how you view the current timeline, an escalating conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore a very specific, glaring divergence. We want to understand the massive gap between U.S. tactical actions and its ultimate strategic goals.
And why the conventional military playbook is supposedly failing against Iran's particular type of resistance.
Yes.
But before we get into the weeds, we need to note that this source material contains highly politically charged statements. It includes heavy critiques of both U.S. and Israeli leadership. Our goal today isn't to take a side or endorse these viewpoints.
Right, absolutely.
We are simply unpacking the strategic analysis and claims presented in the text to help you understand the broader concepts at play. We are focusing purely on the strategic math and the geopolitical theory, not the underlying politics.
Okay, let's unpack this, because Macgregor starts by painting a really vivid picture of the first 24 to 36 hours of this scenario. And if you were just looking at a standard military scorecard, you'd probably think the U.S. was winning in an absolute landslide.
Oh, without a doubt. On paper, it looks like total domination.
Right. He describes sweeping tactical successes specifically: the targeted assassination of the Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, alongside a host of other key personalities. Now, by conventional metrics, that's a classic decapitation strike. You cut off the head of the snake and the body dies. Isn't that the standard assumption?
It is the standard assumption, yeah, but that is actually the core thesis of Macgregor's entire argument. Tactics win battles, but strategy wins wars.
Okay.
He argues that the United States has demonstrated absolute tactical supremacy, but possesses a complete strategic void.
How so? Like, can you break down the difference there for someone who might conflate the two? Because they sound similar.
Sure. Think of it this way. A tactical win is an isolated event. It's taking out a key leader, destroying a specific nuclear facility, or sinking a ship. You execute the mission successfully.
Check the box.
Exactly. Check the box. A strategic win, however, is achieving your ultimate political goal for the conflict. In this scenario, the strategic goal seems to be regime change, or at least forcing Iran into a state of total, permanent submission to Western demands.
Right.
Macgregor's point is that stringing together a bunch of explosive tactical wins doesn't automatically equal a strategic victory, not if the enemy's fundamental will to fight remains intact.
Which brings us back to that real estate analogy from the interview, which is honestly such a fascinating lens to look through. Macgregor specifically points to the mindset of U.S. leadership. He references President Trump's background to make a broader point about American foreign policy.
That's a transactional mindset.
Exactly. He suggests the U.S. treats this incredibly complex, deeply historical Middle Eastern conflict like a brutal New York real estate deal. The expectation is entirely transactional. We use our overwhelming, multi-trillion-dollar military might to inflict unthinkable damage. The opponent is supposed to be shocked.
They're supposed to realize they're completely outgunned.
Right. They realize they're outgunned, they beg for mercy, and they agree to whatever peace deal is slid across the table.
It's a very Western, highly corporate way of viewing conflict. It assumes the other side operates on a pure cost-benefit analysis where survival and profit outweigh everything else.
But that's not the case here.
No, the reality check provided here is sobering. You're not trying to execute a hostile takeover of a struggling startup. Iran is a massive, heavily fortified country.
Right, we're talking about 93 million people.
Exactly. 93 million people in a country geographically roughly the size of Western Europe.
What?
The idea that you can just lob missiles from aircraft carriers hundreds of miles away, cross your fingers that the government collapses, and wait for the remaining leadership to pick up the phone and beg Washington for a ceasefire. Macgregor argues that simply does not comport with reality.
It feels like trying to sink an aircraft carrier with a sniper rifle. Sure, your aim is perfect, you hit the radar dish exactly where you wanted, but the ship itself is completely unfazed and still coming right at you.
That's a great way to visualize it.
Yeah.
And that leads directly to a fundamental misunderstanding of who exactly the U.S. is fighting in this scenario.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Deason and McGregor completely redefine the opponent. They argue the U.S. isn't just fighting a modern political state defined by lines drawn on a map in the 20th century. They are arguing that the U.S. is essentially fighting Persia.
What's fascinating here is the concept of what McGregor calls civilizational resistance. To really grasp why the real estate mentality fails, you have to understand that Iran is a 2,700-year-old civilizational state.
Let me pause you there because the interview draws a really sharp contrast between Iran and the surrounding nations. It describes many of the neighbors as artificial constructs born out of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. For those listening who aren't historians, what exactly does that mean in this context?
Of course. So, during and immediately after World War I, British and French diplomats, specifically Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, literally sat in rooms with maps and drew arbitrary lines across the Middle East to divide up the fallen Ottoman Empire.
Just carved it up?
Yeah. They created borders for new countries based on their own imperial interests, often completely ignoring the ethnic, religious, or tribal realities on the ground.
So they just mashed different groups together or split unified groups apart simply because it looked tidy on a map in London or Paris.
Precisely. And because those states were essentially artificially engineered by external powers, their national identities can sometimes be fragile. But Iran wasn't created by a British or French pen. Persian civilization, its language, its art, its philosophy, its deeply rooted sense of self, spans millennia. It is indigenous and organic.
That makes a huge difference.
It does. So when you attack a civilizational state, they do not respond like a fragile, artificial political construct that might fracture under pressure. They draw on thousands of years of shared identity to push back.
Which completely explains the counterintuitive outcome they describe regarding the assassination of the supreme leader. The U.S. expectation, again, that transactional real estate mindset, assumed that killing Ayatollah Khamenei would cause the regime to instantly fracture. They assumed people would be pouring out of their homes, quote, dancing in the streets, celebrating the fall of a dictator.
But McGregor claims the exact opposite happened. He notes a crucial detail. Khamenei likely knew he was in the crosshairs. He knew he was a target, yet he deliberately chose to stay where he knew the strike would happen.
Wow.
Because of that calculated choice, he didn't die as a defeated, fleeing politician. He died as a martyr defending the homeland.
Let me play devil's advocate for a second, though. We know there is massive internal dissent in Iran. Wouldn't the people who actively protest the regime, who want a more secular society, wouldn't they still celebrate his removal?
You would think so, but McGregor makes a point to emphasize that even Iranians who had walked away from rigid, ideological Islam people who fundamentally disagreed with his politics still honored that sacrifice.
Because it was an attack from the outside.
Exactly. Because the attack came from an external Western power, it triggered that deep Persian civilizational defense mechanism. Instead of breaking the country apart into warring factions, the strike galvanized the population. It mobilized 93 million citizens, not for the regime, but against the attackers.
So, if we distill this down for you, the listener, the ultimate takeaway from this part of the discussion is this. You can assassinate a leader with absolute billion-dollar precision, but you cannot bomb a deeply rooted civilization into submission. When you project your own Western transactional values onto an ancient civilizational state, you completely misread the battlefield.
And that misreading is exactly what paves the way for the retaliation. Because, as the analysis lays out, Iran doesn't capitulate. They don't call Washington. Instead, they vastly expand the scope of the conflict. They regionalize the war.
The data points Deason and McGregor provide here are staggering. They note that Iran targeted at least 27 different bases in response, ranging all the way from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey way down to Dubai in the Gulf. They didn't just hit back locally, they essentially set the entire region on fire.
This is where we have to talk about the reality of asymmetric warfare.
Yes, let's define that because it's a buzzword that gets thrown around a lot. I always think of it as the ultimate David and Goliath math. It's when two forces have vastly different levels of military power and technology, so the weaker side uses unconventional tactics to exploit the stronger side's vulnerabilities.
That's spot on. And the analysis describes a perfect example of this. You have a scenario where highly inexpensive Iranian drones, Things that can be mass-produced for relatively little money are effectively overwhelming and defeating some of the world's most sophisticated and eye-wateringly expensive air and missile defenses.
It's like using $1 million Lamborghini to deliver a single $10 pizza. Sure, it gets there fast, but eventually you are just going to run out of gas money. It's economically unsustainable.
The economics of it are brutal, and the math gets exponentially worse when you look at the logistical crisis McGregor outlines regarding the missile gap. He estimates that the U.S. is down to roughly 4,000 missiles in its regional inventory.
Wait, hold on. The U.S. military budget is astronomical compared to Iran's. It's approaching $1 trillion a year. How is it possible that the U.S. just runs out of missiles first? Is it purely a manufacturing bottleneck?
It's a combination of factors. First, McGregor points out that the U.S. inventory has been heavily depleted because of the continuous supply of vast numbers of weapons and interceptors to Ukraine.
Right.
You can't just 3D print a Patriot missile overnight. They take a long time to build, so the stockpile is already low. Second is the sheer volume on the other side. Contrast that 4,000 number with his estimate for Iran, roughly 450,000 missiles.
4,000 versus 450,000. That disparity is hard to wrap your head around.
It's a logistical nightmare because of the math of missile defense. To confidently take down one incoming threat, you generally have to fire 2, sometimes 3 interceptors to ensure a hit.
Oh, wow.
So if you only have 4,000 interceptors, you are completely out of ammunition after just over 1,000 incoming targets. When the enemy has 450,000, you are mathematically destined to be overwhelmed.
And it's not just the sheer volume that's the problem, it's the speed. McGregor notes that Iran is utilizing hypersonic missiles coming in at Mach 3, 4, 5, and 6. Just to ground that for you listening, Mach 6 is over 4,500 miles per hour. That is over a mile per second.
Speeds that, according to this analysis, are beyond current technological capabilities to consistently track and defeat. Furthermore, they are pairing these hypersonics with cheap decoys.
Just to confuse the radar.
Exactly. So you have incredibly expensive limited systems like Israel's Iron Dome and U.S. defense grids preoccupied with tracking and firing at fake warheads, while the real, highly destructive missiles slip right through.
The result of this relentless barrage is a massive logistical retreat. The interview explicitly states that the ports the U.S. habitually uses in the region to replenish its naval forces and reload those precious few missiles have been destroyed or rendered entirely unsafe.
They have nowhere to park.
Right. The U.S. military is forced to fall back thousands of miles all the way to India or Italy just to rearm. That is a massive loss of power projection. You can't control a region if you can't safely park your ships there.
Exactly. And we cannot overlook how this military failure immediately bleeds into a global economic shockwave. The commercial reality Desi and McGregor describe is grim.
It's devastating. They note that oil markets would immediately open 20% higher, putting crude on a rapid trajectory toward well over $100 a barrel. The Strait of Hormuz is shut down. The Red Sea is shut down, which effectively closes the Suez Canal for all intents and purposes. Suddenly, global shipping is paralyzed.
It grinds to a halt.
Yeah. But what really struck me was how they grounded this massive global event in a very specific human cost. They mentioned that there are roughly 4.6 million Indians who own businesses or are working in the Emirates who are suddenly stranded in a war zone.
The economic ripple effect of that alone is massive, not just for the UAE, but for India.
Right. They calculate that a mere $10 rise in crude oil prices equates to a $15 billion burden on the Indian economy. So you have everyday Indian families thousands of miles away from the kinetic conflict, struggling to afford basic goods. They're essentially paying a $15 billion war tax for a conflict they never voted for and want absolutely no part of.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what Desi and McGregor are really describing here is the rapid, real-time shattering of U.S. credibility. The United States entered this hypothetical conflict to project invincibility.
To show they're still the boss?
Yes, the goal was to show the world that American military power is still the ultimate deterrent, the bedrock of global stability. But instead, according to their analysis, it is exposing profound systemic vulnerabilities.
And this brings up a highly controversial claim from McGregor, which is a good moment to remind you, the listener, of our impartiality stance. We are analyzing the arguments made in the text, not endorsing them, but he makes the striking claim that the U.S. didn't even start this war. He asserts that Israel initiated the attack without warning Washington, and that the U.S. only joined in late because they felt politically compelled to. He argues that the U.S. is effectively taking orders from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and in the process, sacrificing America's own strategic position in the Middle East.
Regardless of the political finger-pointing about who fired the first shot, the strategic consequence they outline is a terrifying potential for uncontrollable escalation. The interview doesn't just stop at conventional warfare. It walks us step by step toward a deeply unsettling climax.
The nightmare scenario.
Yes. As the missile barrage continues, as the Iron Dome is completely overwhelmed, and as the U.S. is forced to retreat to Italy, they predict a scenario where Israel becomes entirely exhausted. Their defense grids are empty. Their infrastructure is crumbling.
And historically speaking, a desperate, exhausted military with its back against the wall is an incredibly dangerous thing.
Precisely. McGregor theorizes that if Iran's relentless, asymmetric attacks cannot be stopped conventionally, an exhausted Israel might feel it has no choice but to resort to utilizing a tactical nuclear weapon to halt the onslaught and ensure its own survival.
Which is the absolute nightmare scenario. But let's walk through the timeline of that. Why does a localized tactical strike immediately jump to World War III?
Because the analysis explicitly claims that if that nuclear threshold is crossed, the conflict instantly goes global. McGregor predicts that Russia and China, who up until this point would have been perfectly content sitting on the sidelines watching the U.S. deplete its resources and embarrass itself, will immediately abandon their neutrality.
Why would they step in? What's their incentive to get involved in a nuclear Middle East?
It comes down to self-preservation and global economics. A nuclear strike in the Middle East threatens their immediate interests, specifically projects like China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, let's clarify that for anyone who might not follow Chinese economic policy. The Belt and Road Initiative, or BRI, is essentially China's massive, multi-trillion-dollar global infrastructure project. Think of it as a modern Silk Road. It's a vast network of railways, energy pipelines, and highways meant to connect Asia with Africa and Europe, fundamentally placing China at the center of global trade.
Exactly. And the Middle East is a critical geographic bridge for the Belt and Road. A nuclear fallout in that region would completely sever that multi-trillion-dollar trade artery. So Russia and China would actively intervene against the U.S. and Israel, not necessarily out of ideological alignment with Iran, but to prevent a nuclear precedent in a region critical to their own survival.
It's a domino effect of catastrophic proportions. And that brings us to the ultimate conclusion synthesized by both Desi and McGregor. They argue that this entire scenario isn't just a localized military failure. It represents a geopolitical earthquake. They view this as the definitive end of an era, the end of American military hegemony.
They state quite bluntly that the map's going to change. The old Sykes-Picot order, those lines drawn in European sitting rooms, is dead. And most importantly, they argue the rules of the New World Order will no longer be dictated from Washington, D.C.
Right. McGregor suggests those new rules are going to be written largely in Asia and to some extent in the Middle East by indigenous peoples, not by external Western powers trying to manage the globe. The U.S., which in the grand scheme of human history is a relative newcomer to the global stage, is fighting the emergence of a new multipolar world. And according to this stark analysis, it is fundamentally losing.
So what does this all mean?
I think when you synthesize all of this, the core lesson for you, the listener, is about that profound, sometimes fatal divergence between tactical wins and strategic success. It's the realization that you can have the most advanced drones, the most precise targeting intelligence, and the most expensive air defense systems in the history of the world. You can win the first 24 hours of a news cycle with a flashy headline about a successful strike.
But it doesn't win the war.
No. Because when a superpower projects its own highly transactional Western values onto an ancient civilizational state, when you expect a 2,700-year-old culture to act like a defeated corporate rival in a real estate negotiation, you create a massive strategic blind spot. And as this analysis argues, that blind spot is large enough to swallow your entire global standing.
This raises an important question. How often do we see this exact disconnect play out in the media we consume daily? This discussion is really a masterclass in why we must look past those flashy tactical headlines. A push notification on your phone will tell you, high-ranking leader eliminated. It sounds like a victory.
It sounds decisive.
But the strategic reality, the 93 million galvanized citizens, the 450,000 incoming missiles, the shattered supply lines is often buried or ignored entirely. When you watch global conflicts unfold, you have to train yourself to ask, what is the actual long-term strategy here beyond just breaking things?
Exactly. It completely reframes how you process the news. And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to mull over today. If absolute military supremacy, endless defense budgets, and highly expensive technology no longer guarantee strategic victory in a world dominated by cheap drone swarms and deeply rooted civilizational identities, what exactly is the new currency of global power?
That is truly the question of the century.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking the big questions, and we will catch you next time.